Meta may have the honor of being the most controversial company in the world today. Its Facebook platform is frequently accused of having contributed to the political dysfunction we were just talking about. In response, the company is spending around $10 billion a year in an effort to build a kinder, gentler metaverse with all the hardware and software required. But there are clearly some headwinds in the real world: slowing earnings, revenue growth, regulatory hurdles, threat to its ad business. To discuss how this is going, how Meta is setting up shop in the metaverse, and its stance on regulation and moderation, please welcome Nick Clegg, the president of Global Affairs at Meta, who is appropriately joining us virtually, and although not as an avatar, so that's good. Thank you for that, Nick. And in conversation with Fortune editor Alyson Shontell. Alyson.
Good morning, everyone, and good morning, Nick. Thank you for being with us here today. So much to discuss with you, but I have to start with Elon and Twitter. Nick, what's your take? Good, bad, scary? Are you talking to him? What's going on? What's your gut reaction there?
Well, he's a week into the job, isn't he? And I think he, in his torrent of tweets, he tweeted yesterday saying being criticised from both the left and the right is a good thing simultaneously. And I felt like saying, yeah, welcome to the club, because that's what happens when you run social media companies and you can't keep everybody happy. And certainly in the United States, half the country thinks that you're taking too much content down, the other half thinks that you should take down more. And it'll be interesting to see the kind of journey he's on, because he's made very big sweeping promises about restoring free expression, as he put it, but then in recent days he seems to be implying that he's going to take a slightly more moderate approach. We've certainly learned the hard way that it's very difficult to strike a balance here which enjoys consensus from everybody. I mean, but remember, Twitter and Facebook, they're very different sort of creatures. Twitter's much more of a kind of text-based thing, whereas we're much more visual these days. Short-form video is around 50% of content on Facebook these days. Twitter tends to get used as a sort of elite product for people in kind of media, politics, cultural elites. Facebook, Instagram is used by billions of people around the world who don't consider themselves to be part of elites. And of course, Twitter is made for people to sort of yell at each other about the news, which is not something that actually a lot of people come to Facebook to do in the first place.
I think you could probably give him some advice, given he's trying to create a moderation council, especially with the decision whether to bring Trump back on the platform. That's something that you obviously had a heavy hand in over at Meta. Any key learnings that you can give him from your creation of the Oversight Committee, which has been integral to moderating or attempting to moderate Meta?
Yeah, so what we did, 2 or 3 years ago, we set up this independent oversight board populated by kind of experts from around the world who are totally independent of the company, generally have a kind of belief in free expression, but come from lots of different directions. They include former heads of government, legal scholars, former journalists, and so on. And it's been very helpful to us because, look, we're a tech company. We're not equipped, if you like, as a tech company to take all those difficult ethical, cultural, and social judgments about exactly what speech, what kind of idiom, what kind of forms of sort of liquid expression, because human communication is one of the most liquid things that you can possibly imagine. It mutates all the time. And having that independent view, and they can impose binding decisions on us, I think is a good start in making sure that not all the power lies with these West Coast tech companies to take these highly, highly consequential decisions. I think everybody wants all of these tech companies who are dealing in human speech to be held to independence and account. And if he does the same thing, I think that'd be a very good thing, actually.
So I have a lot of questions to ask about moderation and that in a bit. But first, I want to go into what everybody's talking about, the metaverse. I want to start at the beginning and then obviously go into where things are now. Investors are not quite as excited as you guys are, so we'll talk about that too. But first, to the beginning. You joined the company, Nick, in 2018. Was the metaverse even on the radar then? Did you know when you were stepping into this big job that you were going to have to pivot the company all around this whole new thing that they'd be betting the future on?
Oh yeah, very much so. I mean, the company had been investing in augmented and virtual reality products for some years. Oculus obviously had been part of the company for some time, well before I arrived. I think what, in a sense, we did last autumn, last fall, was to make something explicit, which was already implicit, which was that a huge amount of resource, headcount, engineers, people, money was being devoted within the company to play a role, because we're not really the only people who are making these investments. So is ByteDance in China, so is Apple, so is Microsoft, and so on, in helping to build this new computing platform. Because that's what it is. It's not a new app, it's not a new feature, it's not a new piece of hardware. You are literally building a new computing platform from the operating system upwards. And that is a multi-year project. It's not a cheap project.
No.
It has very different stages to it. In fact, many of the most significant investments are invested in the stuff that is at the moment least visible, and that's all around augmented reality, which everybody in the industry agrees is the real holy grail here. It really will be the game changer. And that's where a lot of the sort of heavy investments are going at the moment. Of course, I totally understand that investors, who quite understandably have sort of quarter-to-quarter pressures, are saying, you know, when are we going to see a return on major investments? But thankfully, they can see that the core business of the existing apps is, you know, is incredibly healthy. I mean, we've now got what? Close to 4 billion people using our apps monthly. More people are using Facebook than ever before. Almost, I think, 2 billion a day. You've got WhatsApp growing very, very fast. You've got 140 billion plays of reels. That's the short form video format every day. And that's monetizing at an increasing pace. So it's about striking a balance between the here today and the long-term investment. We need to keep explaining that long-term investment is something we have faith in, that we're not doing it on our own. But the metaverse will be built regardless of whether Meta, the company, exists or not.
So I think there are definitely things that are going well in Meta. Like, I think Reels have taken off in a big way, short form video, WhatsApp, there. But the core business is in a bit of decline. I think Mark said at a recent town hall meeting there that, like for 18 years, the company was growing, and now it's not. And now we need to make adjustments. And it looks like things are going to be harder on the employees. There's no quiet quitting allowed at Meta anymore, things of that nature. But also just, investors, I think, have really lost confidence. One of your long-term shareholders said, hey, how about spending $5 billion on the metaverse instead of $10 billion a year? And sort of in your last earnings, you guys are like, nope, we're going to be spending more. Get ready. So almost sort of like you don't care, which you're steadfast on it. But are you rethinking anything on this investment strategy within Meta? Is any of the 71% decline in the stock making you pause? Rethink, like maybe we should go a little slower, invest a little less. It's hard to predict the future. It's hard to build the future. No one knows what the future is going to be like in 10 years. A lot of ways this can go wrong.
Sure, of course it can. No one can predict the future, but you can make informed and smart bets on it. And I think one of the exciting things at Meta, at least I find that, having been here now for 4 years, is that the normal innovator's dilemma is that if you're lucky enough to invent new technology which is disruptive and then enjoys explosive growth, what normally happens is that people rest on their laurels, get a bit complacent, they become vested interests, they're not really kind of looking around for the next big thing. I think one of the unusual things in having a founder-led company is that restlessness to continue to invest in the next new wave of technological development remains alive and well. And I think in the long run, that's going to put the company in good stead. In the meantime, to your point, yes, of course we need to show investors that we're being sensible about our costs, that we're scrutinizing increases in headcount, that we're scrutinizing significant CapEx expenditure, that we're investing particularly in new AI capability, which is going to be the real kind of pumping heart of so much of these machine learning systems going forward. And I think you'll see us making that very clear. But at the same time, I think we are entitled to be pretty forthright in rejecting what is actually, I think, a bit of a sort of lazy headline caricature of the health of our existing business. It just can't be. It just doesn't seem to me to reconcile with the pessimistic headlines about Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, and so on. When Facebook has more daily users now than ever, in fact, we added millions in the last quarter. WhatsApp is growing very fast indeed. It's now got 2 billion daily actives, and we haven't even monetized a lot of those apps. apps. I mean, if you look at the business messaging business we have on Instagram Direct, Messenger, and WhatsApp, where businesses use messaging to communicate with their customers, that's a $1 billion plus dollar. More than 1 billion people are using those business messaging tools, but that can grow a whole lot faster in the months and years to come. So look, I think, yes, we've got to be disciplined about costs where it's right to do that. We've got to explain to people why you can't just invent these AR and VR computing platforms overnight. It does take time, it does take patience, it does take investment. And at the same time, I think we're going to be pretty robust in explaining that our core business is doing very well indeed.
Is there a reason not to build the metaverse as a separate company? I know it's a huge investment in dollars, but it does seem like it's something that you could do separately without kind of drawing all this attention away from the core business.
Well, I think the reason, the sort of fundamental principal reason not to do so is it's all trying to do the same thing. It's all trying to facilitate new technologies by which people can make connections with each other, particularly with family and friends, and in doing so, create wonderful, beautiful new things online, whether it's new businesses, new relationships, new movements, new groups, new ideas. And in a sense, the metaverse it's a rather sort of grand term, but it's actually in many ways a continuum of what you've seen develop over many years. Of course, it sounds revolutionary, it sounds slightly like science fiction, and I know that you had a session yesterday where people demonstrated how you could educate budding surgeons. I think it was on sort of knee surgery, using VR technologies. There's huge health and education potential involved in all of that. But if you think about it historically, we started with desktops, then we moved to laptops, and now we all walk around with a mobile, clutched in the palm of our hand. We believe, as many others do as well, that eventually we're going to graduate from mobile phones to something that you perch on the bridge of your nose and which uses optic technology to communicate with each other through avatars, through holograms, and so on. And it's all about making technology easier, more seamless, almost more invisible when you use it as a human being, and making communication with other human beings in a way which can totally override geographical distance all the easier. So it is much more intimately bound up, if you like, with the mission of the company than I think the suggestion of splitting these things off suggests.
So there's a lot there. I think a lot of this time will tell, and investors will have to decide if they want to stick around for that ride or not. I'd like to move over into content moderation. You stated at the beginning that with the oversight committee, that sort of thing is helpful. It's really hard to moderate a platform as big as Meta has become. Big 3 billion people on it. Most of the world's population uses it. At the same time, your stance is that it sort of seems to be, it's become too big for Meta to manage. They can't possibly manage it by themselves. The government needs to step in. Is that a fair characterization of your stance?
I think there are certain areas where it's just not appropriate for the private sector, in whatever guise, to start taking decisions which have such profound societal impact. I mean, we're just a few days away from midterms. We're just a few days after this very consequential election in Brazil. We pour immense resources in trying to make sure that our apps are used safely and responsibly during the elections. We invested $5 billion last year alone in those kind of safety integrity tools. We have over 40,000 people working on it. We have very strict guidelines about what people can and can't do on our platforms. But in the end, the US elections, to take a very timely example, they're not our elections. They belong to the American people and to their representatives in Congress. And in the end, you would hope that legislators in Congress would decide what the rules should be about what is and what is not allowed at election time, or indeed at any other time. It seems to me very curious that in the United States you don't have any federal privacy legislation. You have privacy legislation in various states, but not in a way that gives people consistent legal privacy rights in the online world enshrined in federal legislation. What else? I mean, data portability sounds very technical. In some respects it is, but it's actually a really important concept. If you want proper competition between these big platforms, it's very important that people should be able to pick up their proverbial data luggage and move it from one company in one service to a competitor service. But that has very big trade-offs with privacy. When you move data around, it's more likely to get lost from time to time. That is a judgment between data portability and privacy, which needs to be made by legislators. Can't be and shouldn't be made by private sector platforms. So look, I mean, I could go on, but I hope that's just an illustration of a number of areas where I strongly believe that it is appropriate for, and of course I spent 20 years of my life in British and European politics before I moved to Silicon Valley, so maybe I come at this with a bias, but I just think there are certain things that should be decided on democratically by the democratically elected political class, not by people, basically tech leaders on the West Coast.
I think part of the issue that people have, though, is that they feel like it was scale at all costs without really thinking about the long-term impact of what it would do to society. And now it's sort of like it spiraled a bit out of control and nobody quite knows what to do. And so to sort of dump it on regulators and to say, this is your problem now, we don't know, that's a bit of a red flag. And then I think as you look at building the metaverse, you wrote a blog post recently that said, how can I trust that these new technologies will be built and governed responsibly as it pertains to the metaverse? If Meta is to scale that to the same level, 3 billion people, how do we make sure that we build that with the benefit of hindsight, where we're doing it better and we don't just kind of throw our hands in the air?
So first, if I may, I really didn't mean to imply, and I don't think it's what I said, that we're somehow trying to sort of, devolve any blame or responsibility from ourselves. Far from it. I'm just simply pointing out that when you have technologies which operate at societal level, you need societal rules. And those rules, in the end of the day, many of them, not all of them, should of course be decided upon by people who are democratically accountable to voters. Secondly, I worry sometimes about the sort of pessimism which I think infuses your question, as if nothing could be done and it's scaled massively and all went horribly wrong. And it's just simply not the case. If you look, for instance, at hate speech, which has quite rightly been a real focus of societal commentary in recent years, the prevalence of hate speech, in other words, how much hate speech can you see if you just keep scrolling on your Facebook app, is now down to 0.02%. That means if you just kept scrolling on your app, you'd find 2 bits of hate speech on Facebook for every 10,000 bits of content that you see. And by the way, that's not just our figures. We have that now independently audited by EY, our auditor, because of course people don't believe that we're going to be the best judge and jury of our own homework. But it's now, that is a prevalence figure that we publish and we update every 12 weeks along with our financial statements as well. And that has been achieved through some of those investments that I referred to earlier, employing tens of thousands of people, including thousands of human moderators, but especially investing in machine learning and AI systems, which can identify that content and either remove it or downrank it. And I think you can see that on terrorism content, on content that is a threat to children, on hate speech, on bullying, on harassment. I think we're now the only platform, as I alluded to earlier, who every 12 weeks publish all that data, allow people to audit it, and allow people to make their own judgment of our progress. My only point to you is it is real progress. We've made massive progress in reducing those harms while still keeping those apps going for the joy and all the wonderful things that thankfully tends to be the majority of content that you see on social media day in, day out.
So in a few minutes, I'm going to open it up to audience questions. So be thinking if you have a question or two to ask. But I want to jump, and Nick, I appreciate your points. There is positivity happening on Meta. But there's obviously more to solve. I wanted to talk a little bit about regulators. Obviously, they've been taking aim in the tech sector for quite a bit, especially here in the US. And abroad. A Giphy acquisition for Meta was just shot down. However, Apple seems to kind of get away with things. I'm curious your stance on that. You've described Apple's iOS privacy changes as an effort to kneecap competitors. Do you feel like regulators are giving Apple a pass? And have you been in touch with them at all about any of these Apple changes?
Oh, I don't think Apple will get away with this scot-free because, firstly, it's self-evident. I'm not revealing anything here. It's public knowledge that regulators in Europe and elsewhere are taking a very close look, and they're taking a very close look for a very good reason, which is that, if you look at the sort of history of the internet, there's generally speaking, I'm caricaturing dramatically here, but there's generally speaking a kind of difference between open ecosystem, just kind of allow full interoperability, full interoperable use of different apps and services. They've got a Linux model is probably the most kind of open source kind of innovation you can think of. And then on the other end of the scale is Apple, who built a highly successful, devastatingly successful, and now 11, 12, 13 times bigger probably, or at least 10 times bigger than Meta as a company. They build this vertically integrated, sort of closed stack. So that, once you use their phones, their operating system, their services, you're all locked into it, and it's extremely difficult to get out of it. And they can charge these very high levies and fees for anyone who wants to get into that ecosystem. And it's no wonder that the European Union has passed the Digital Markets Act, for instance, precisely to bust open that very closed ecosystem, which is often explained in terms of protecting people's privacy, but is just as much, as often as it is a case, as we now see, of Apple doing a fair amount of damage to some of their competitors when it comes to online advertising, and then building up their own advertising business very rapidly, using in effect exactly the same kind of data signals. So look, I think everybody who does well and grows very fast should be subject to regulatory scrutiny. I'm certainly not suggesting that Meta should in any way be exempt from that, but equally, I think it is fair to suggest that, particularly when companies create these very closed walled gardens, if you like, at such a vast scale and at such a lucrative scale, that should be scrutinized. And I think it is, and I think it will be.
Audience, any questions? If not, I'll close with one. No? Okay. So given the regulatory backdrop and all that's going on, TikTok has risen quickly in China. A lot of China companies money's being pumped in. A lot of American companies are struggling to get into that market or are being kept out. At the same time, they have access to our market. There is a chance, maybe there have been discussions that TikTok could potentially someday be banned. That's ongoing. The FCC commissioner recently said he doesn't really see any other way but to do that in the US, given all the privacy and data challenges there. But do you think, given the broad scope picture of regulation on US companies and China sort of being able to grow as it wants, is Silicon Valley under threat? Do you think that companies like Meta can grow out of innovative companies here anymore, or is that being challenged?
I think the first thing I'd say, without sounding unduly melodramatic about it, is that the global internet does not exist. We keep talking about these great American success stories doing so well on the global internet. It doesn't exist. You have a Chinese internet, which is basically walled off from the rest of the world. The Chinese citizens are very heavily surveilled within it. And then you have the sort of non-Chinese internet, which itself is becoming increasingly fragmented. And people talk about the increasing move towards the splinternet. If you look at some of the rules, and I deal with this day in, day out, a great deal on behalf of Meta, new internet rules in Vietnam, in Turkey, in India and elsewhere. There is a real risk that in 10 years' time we'll look back on this era as an unprecedented era of openness. And in that context, I think that there is a real problem that there just isn't a level playing field between some of the big sort of mega Chinese companies and the big American tech companies. TikTok is a good example. It has this vast domestic market in China. It competes directly with companies such as us in the United States, yet we're not able to compete with its home market. And I do think that there are legitimate questions going forward about how can we create both an open internet, not a balkanized one, but one which has a proper level playing field. And when it comes to TikTok, for instance, because I think TikTok's fantastic success, they've been fantastically successful, is heavily driven by a much more algorithmically orchestrated approach to content than Facebook. Facebook, for instance, still relies very heavily on who your friends and your family are, what comments you've made and what groups you're part of, whereas TikTok is basically just a pure algorithmic flywheel. You watch a video and the algorithm proposes the next one for you to watch and so on. That algorithm, of course, is designed in China. And when more and more people in the US are consuming their news from TikTok, I think that algorithm, people keep hearing people in DC talk about where the data is located. That's not really the issue. The issue is the fundamental design about what you see and in which order. That's the really key question always with these social media apps. And I think it's a legitimate question to know who decides that, how is it decided, what are the values behind that. And I just hope, across the piece, we see more and more transparency for all these algorithmic systems used by all these social media companies going forward.
Okay, well, Nick, thank you so much for this wide-ranging conversation. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.